But a very warm welcome to all of you. Welcome to this session, Art, Scripture and Contemporary Issues, which is making use of the visual commentary on Scripture. This is a session that is part of Living God's Future Now, the online festival of theology, ideas and practice from Heart Edge. And Heart Edge itself is an international and ecumenical movement for renewal within the broad church. We are a network of churches growing compassionate responses to needs, cultural and commercial activities and congregational life. And we'll be posting more information about Heart Edge and Living God's Future Now events in the chat towards the end of this session. The visual commentary on Scripture is the first online project to introduce visitors to the entirety of Christian Scripture in the company of artists. And in this short series, curators for the visual commentary on Scripture are going to be speaking about their experience of curating for the VCS. That's in order to assist us in understanding more deeply the value and the potential uses to which these exhibitions can be put by churches. Today, we're very pleased to have Froehlich, who is speaking about his experience of curating the Cities of Refuge exhibition and exploring why he made the choices and decisions that he did in relation to both text and image. So this is a session that will help us to consider the provisions of the biblical cities of refuge and to do so from the perspective of sanctuary seekers. We're very pleased to have Caleb with us. He's a researcher for the St. Andrews Encyclopedia of Theology and an editor for De Gruyter's Encyclopedia of the Bible and its Reception. He holds a PhD in Religion, Art and Culture from the University of St. Andrews and has two principal areas of research: the intersection between religion and popular culture and also culturally engaged theology. So it's a great joy to be able to welcome Caleb today, and we're looking forward to hearing all that he has to share with us. So I'm now going to hand over to Caleb. Welcome.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this excellent series. I've been able to attend a couple of the sessions already, and I've been extremely impressed with the discussion and the presentations. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so although I'll be discussing Scripture in this session, I wouldn't consider myself to be a biblical scholar. As Jonathan has already mentioned, my specialty is really in the intersection between religion, arts, and culture. And a part of my research in this intersection is looking at how people interact with works of art and use inner and outer draw on inner and outer resources to construct spiritual and religious meaning. And in fact, next month I'll be starting a position at the University of Edinburgh where I'll be exploring the art and spiritual reality and the experiences of people at the Fringe Festival, which, as many of you know, is the largest art festival in the world. So I'm very excited to do that. So when Jonathan asked me to talk about my experience curating an exhibition on the Cities of Refuge for the visual commentary on Scripture, it was a unique opportunity for me to utilize some of these research skills on myself. And in reflecting on this experience, it became increasingly evident to me that my own interactions with these artworks and texts they were much less straightforward than I initially remembered them to be. My curation of the exhibition was an evolving process with several steps, and with each new step, my understanding of the biblical passage grew. So what I want to do in this session is to take you through these growing steps. And I know that Jonathan has already introduced the visual commentary in Scripture, but if you haven't gone to the visual, if you haven't visited it, I would highly recommend you do. There's tons of virtual exhibitions with commentaries and they cover passages in the Old Testament and the New Testament and even in the Apocrypha. My own exhibition, oops. Uh-oh. Oh, that's the site for the visual commentary in Scripture. My own exhibition covered Numbers 35, Deuteronomies 4, 41 through 43, and Joshua 20. And you can see the three artworks up top there that I paired with these passages. In these passages, they report the appointment of Levitical cities, 6 Levitical cities, as cities of refuge to ensure that anyone who has killed someone accidentally can flee to the city and be protected from the Avenger of Blood, who is usually the closest male relative to the deceased. And they were legally responsible for carrying out vengeance for the deceased. And this accidental killer would then live in the city until the death of the officiating high priest, after which he or she would be free to return to their normal lifestyle. So how did I come about choosing these passages? Well, I didn't actually originally set out to do a VCS exhibition on the cities of refuge. I had followed the development of the VCS since its inception, and I thought it was a really unique and worthwhile project. So I reached out to Ben Quash, who's the director of the VCS, in 2019 to see if I can contribute a series of articles on God's calling of young Samuel in 1 Samuel 3, because I had recently worked on this passage in another project. But Ben informed me that the commentary was prioritizing non-narrative passages and asked me if I could do something on the legal material of Numbers 26 through 36. And as you can probably expect, I was a bit surprised by this and also a bit hesitant. Numbers isn't exactly a book that is known for inspiring great art. But I'm usually up for a challenge. So I looked through these chapters and I was immediately drawn to the cities of refuge, texts in Numbers 35. And at that time, and even today, countries all over the world were grappling with this massive influx of refugees. And in 2019, the UNHRC reported that almost 80 million people were forcibly displaced that year. And many of these countries were struggling with issues such as border control policies, refugee resettlements, and ongoing xenophobia and anti-migrant sentiments. So I thought the cities of refuge would be able to speak meaningfully into these different issues. And when I proposed the idea to Ben, he thought it would be an excellent addition to the commentary. However, at risk of complicating things further, he suggested that I write on Numbers 35 alongside Joshua 20 and Deuteronomy 4, 41 through 43. And since they all dealt with the cities of refuge, and that's what I set out to do. So I didn't actually start off with a clear method of how I was going to relate these artworks with the passages. But I thought that if I just started exploring different artistic possibilities, that something might just click and open up interpretive avenues. So I had done some work on pieces by the Chinese artist and activist Ai Weiwei in the past, and I knew that he had recently did a multi-site exhibition called "Good Fences Make Good Neighbors," which addressed the global refugee crisis around that time. This is one of the pieces from that. This exhibition was on view from 2017 to 2018, and it comprised of over 300 site installations that spanned across the 5 boroughs of New York City. And as you can see from this one, the installations were quite unique. They consisted of immersive large-scale sculptures like this golden cage. They put fences on building facades and at bus stops. And you can see this, they even put a seat on the other side of this fence, which is just some, it's a very ambiguous feature of this piece. And they also put faces of refugees on banners hanging on lampposts and other outdoor spaces. And what I really wanted was these pieces to be woven into the very fabric of the city, providing people places to sit and recline, to admire and explore, and all the while raising these difficult themes about surrounding the refugee experience. And I really wanted to incorporate works from this exhibition, but it wasn't really clear to me how I would link them to these biblical texts. So for that time being, I just set this exhibition on the back burner, and I thought it would be easier to relate the artworks to the biblical texts if they had been explicitly inspired by the cities of refuge. So I did an online search, and what I found was a bit disappointing, in my view. The problem was that all the works were very similar, as you can see, and they're very direct representation of the text. Almost every image was someone running towards a city gate, and there are armed men or an armed man in hot pursuit behind them. And these kinds of images didn't really add to my initial understanding of the text, or they didn't really evoke fresh insights for me, although they possibly could have for other people. So this kind of throwing artworks, trying to stick them to the wall, wasn't really working out. So I decided to change my approach. Instead of looking at themes and artworks that were already linked to the biblical texts, I looked to the biblical texts themselves for phrases that I could link to the works, to artworks, as well as to contemporary issues. And see, these were some of the themes or some of the phrases that attracted me at the time. To dwell in, which is referring to the Levites, the Avenger of Blood. Blood pollutes the land, and refuge for the stranger and the sojourner. And of these 4, I ended up focusing on the last 2. This notion of blood polluting the land is more of a theological rationale for penalties attached to the taking of innocent life, whether that was intentional or unintentional. And the idea comes from Cain and Abel, where the blood cries out from the ground for vengeance. And so this taking of innocent human life had to be atoned for by the death of the murderer, or in the case of the accidental killer, the death of the officiating high priest who would die in place of the accidental killer. And when I thought this was a really interesting idea. And so I started looking for artworks that illustrated this idea of blood pollution. And I came across these articles that talked about an artist named Michael Carr, who had painted over 200 outlines of human bodies all across Washington, D.C. and to raise awareness of escalating amount of violent deaths at that time, which was 1994. And I thought this would be a really interesting way to illustrate this idea of blood polluting the land or innocent death. But there weren't really any images of, there was only one image of his work, and that was this one, and it wasn't a very compelling image. And I also realized in the course of researching blood pollution, I was really moving away from my initial idea, which was to keep the cities of refuge in the center. So I then moved on to the second phrase, this idea of refuge for the stranger and the sojourner. And I started to look at this phrase in relation to sanctuary cities. And I found that contemporary sanctuary cities, and I found that a lot of contemporary sanctuary city movements trace their policies back to the biblical cities of refuge. And they cited these passages that you see on the screen when referring to their own city-based sanctuary practices. And so I started thinking, oh, okay, so I started looking for this connection between the biblical cities of refuge and current sanctuary city practices prompted me to look for artworks related to sanctuary cities, thinking I could connect these to the text. And I came across, oh, that's the sanctuary city movement. I came across an exhibition called Sanctuary City with Liberty and Justice for Some. And over 200 artists participated in this year-long exhibition, and they contributed portraits of their friends and family, relatives and neighbors, and celebrities and other figures. And all the people depicted in these portraits were either refugees or immigrants that had contributed something significant to American society. And I wanted to use something from this exhibition, but I didn't have a clear sense of how I would link these artworks to this notion of refuge or welcome to the stranger. There's some portraits there. These ones particularly stuck out to me at the time. I really liked the way the artists captured the resolve and determination on the faces of these individuals. The one on the far left, amongst the foliage, is Khalil Gibran, and then there's Madeleine Albright, and then Bela Lugosi. When I was exploring this connection between the biblical cities of refuge and sanctuary cities, something I found really intriguing, and perhaps not very surprising, is that they make no reference to the examination that occurs at the gates of the city of refuge. At the time when a accused killer arrived at the city gate, the elders of the city would conduct a trial, and they would conduct the trial to see if the accused killer had killed intentionally, and if intentionally, the accused killer would be handed over to the Avenger of Blood, who had the right to execute the person right then and there. If unintentionally, they would be admitted into the protection of the city of refuge. And in this way, the cities practiced a kind of complex hospitality, a hospitality that was characterized by both welcome and exclusion. And this tension at the gates of the cities of refuge brought me back to the Good Fences exhibition by Ai Weiwei. And in particular, in particular arch, which was the, let's see. Oh yeah, so in particular arch, which was the signature work of the whole entire exhibition. This is a 37-foot tall stainless steel cage with a reflective passageway in the middle, as you can see, in the form of two embracing human figures. And it occupies the center of the Washington Square Arch. And if you look at it, there's several layers of symbolism present here that communicate these tensions of the national borders. The embracing figures suggest this openness and welcome, and they're combined with the cage, which suggests exclusion and prohibition. And what's more, this cage is placed within the Washington Square Arch, which draws its own form off of a triumphal Roman arch, which is intended to celebrate, in this case, the military victories and might of the United States and the military hero, George Washington. And the placement of this sculpture within the Washington Square Arch raises questions about how strong borders may or may not be compatible with welcoming borders. And as I was mulling this over in my mind, I ran across a rather extraordinary article entitled "Cities of Refuge" by a non-practicing Jew named Marion Gray. And in the article, Marion Gray recounts how in her early 20s, she had accidentally run over a little boy with her car. And in the tremendous personal and spiritual turmoil she faced as a result of this tragic accident. And in fact, for the next few decades, she restricted her social interaction, and she also avoided the idea of motherhood, and ultimately blamed God for the incident and her suffering. And it wasn't until her late 40s that she started to look for others that also had accidentally killed somebody or had a similar experience to her. And in her search, she came across a rabbi who was blogging about the provisions of the cities of refuge. And this encounter with both the texts and the rabbi completely transformed her perspective. This is how she expressed it. Oh. She said, I had felt so disconnected from Judaism and so harshly judged. And then decades after I checked the whole thing, there were entire chapters laying out exactly how society is supposed to respond to people like me. The Torah wasn't just telling me that I was a horrible person. Even God found me deserving of asylum. And she now has a website, a kind of virtual city of refuge, as it were, where people who have killed accidentally can talk openly about their struggles and find a supportive community. This is her webpage here. Her story also transformed my perspective as well, prompting me to approach the cities of refuge from the standpoint of a sanctuary seeker. And like her, I also became interested in the experiences of people who had accidentally killed somebody. And so I set out to look for art that expressed this kind of experience. And during my search, I came across another Al Jazeera article entitled "Albania: The Dark Shadow of Tradition and Blood Feuds." And this article talks about this ancient code in Albania that obliges the murderer to be repaid with murder. And sometimes this repayment can descend into blood feuds, which span entire generations forcing entire families into confinement in their own homes. The Albanian government has actually tried to discourage these practices with penalties, harsher penalties, but the blood feud tradition still influences the lives of many people in Albania. And the article contains 7 photographs of people confined in their own homes. And most of these photographs depict people who had either murdered someone or had inherited a blood feud. But the last photograph in the article was a photograph of an accidental killer. And I thought this was the most intriguing photograph of the 7. This photograph is taken by Italian photographer Carlo Ginafero, and it's of Gjan Bashmiste. And Gjan had accidentally killed a girl, and he's now confined to his own house in Vraka, because he fears that the girl's family will come and retaliate with a revenge killing, not unlike the blood vengeance in ancient Israel. And if we view the photo, there's almost like a palpable sense of misery and despair. You can see his shoulders are slouched forward, almost like he's carrying a great weight, and he's exhaling smoke from his cigarette, which shrouds much of his facial features. The smoke in his face makes it look like his very personhood is disappearing, and he's kind of fading away into his own dilapidated environs. If the lives of sanctuary seekers in ancient Israel were at all comparable to the conditions that Gjan and other Albanians like him face on a daily basis, then the relief that the cities of refuge provided was much more than just simply survival. It was a chance for these sanctuary seekers to begin a new life and restore a sense of personhood that's unfettered by the previous tragedy. And this restorative relief that the sanctuary seekers provided brought me back to the Sanctuary City exhibition, because I saw in these portraits, they celebrated, the portraits celebrated the very personhood of their subjects. And the one work that I was particularly drawn to was Monica Lundy's portrait of the Hungarian-born actor Bela Lugosi. Bela had fled his land during the Hungarian Revolution in 1919 and migrated to the United States, where he became an icon of American horror films. You might actually recognize his face from Todd Browning's classic film, where he played Count Dracula. And in fact, the stereotypical Dracula voice that we all know, I'm not going to impersonate it here, is based off of his performance. Lundy painted his face over silver leaf to play with this notion of the silver screen, which was synonymous with the era of Hollywood in which he reached the height of his career. She also, as you can see, has a very tactile method of paint application. She uses drips and smudges and streaks to define his face over this opulent background. And in that way, this painting could be representative both of the kind of struggles that he faced in this distressed look as a refugee, as well as his success in the film industry. The provisions offered to sanctuary seekers in the cities of refuge are all summed up in these passages with one simple phrase: and live. And this could just mean survival, but according to Talmudic traditions, which is a quintessential text for Jewish law, the phrase meant much more than protection from blood vengeance. It meant the sanctuary seekers were entitled to all the amenities that would allow them to live as productive members of society, including opportunities for education and employment and eligibility to receive honors. Given these provisions, we might imagine a similar commemorative portrait being created for a sanctuary seeker in the city of refuge. The provisions and support available in these cities in Talmudic tradition would allow these refugees to rise high, perhaps even scale the same heights that Bella and other celebrities have done and are commemorated in the Sanctuary City exhibition. And with this portrait, I had collected the three artworks I wanted to bring into dialogues with the cities of refuge texts. And when I placed them side by side, it became apparent to me that these three works, when placed in this particular order, from left to right, depicted different stages of the sanctuary seeker's journey. The photograph of Gajan is the refugee outside the safety of the city walls. Arches, the city gate, where the refugee undergoes a requisite process to enter the city. And the painting of Lugosi shows the heights a refugee could achieve with the provisions within the city walls. And what became progressively apparent to me when researching artworks for this visual commentary was the prominence of human faces in the artworks. And when I reflected on why this might be, it occurred to me that a person who is rendered faceless and nameless, for example, being called as a descriptor like killer or illegal alien, rather than their personal names, this makes them more other, and as other, they're regarded as less human and become more vulnerable to atrocities. And the biblical cities of refuge worked against this kind of dehumanization by providing an alternative to the prior tradition of blood vengeance, where this tradition maintained that the blood avenger had the right to kill the accused with impunity, regardless of whether the accused was actually culpable of murder. The cities of refuge brought to light the extenuating circumstances of the killing so that the accused might be considered innocent of murder and live their life in the safety of the city as a valued member of the community. So in this setting where the accused was essentially rendered faceless, their identity completely identified with one tragic occurrence, the cities were opportunities for hospitality and rehabilitation and justice, looking beyond stigmas. They were places for face-to-face encounters. And you may have noticed that all three artworks that we've examined here play with this notion of a face-to-face encounter between the audience and the artwork. And while each of these encounters, each of these artworks use encounters to challenge viewers with the experiences of refugees in today's socio-political climate, they also draw out the challenge of the texts in scripture. For example, this photograph of Gajan, the smoke in his face really hinders our attempts to empathize with him and his situation. Whatever fear, guilt, and shame he might be feeling, it can only really be hinted at through his eyes, which even evade our gaze by looking down and away. What we're presented here with is a nearly faceless killer. By contrast, Monica Lundy's portrait of Bela Lugosi places his face in full view. And there's a kind of monumentality to this painting with its silver background and Lugosi's determined look. But this monumentality is actually at odds with its very small scale. I don't know if you noticed this earlier, but this painting is only about 2 inches long and 2 inches wide. So similar to how I did earlier, we could interpret this tactile paint application in diminutive size as representing the struggles and seeming insignificance he faced as a refugee. But it could also be this powerful expression of the efforts that he and others have provided or have undertaken to allow him to prosper and rise high in this new setting. Ai Weiwei's immersive sculpture differs from these other two in that a human face is now actually it's not part of its structural composition. Instead, visitors encounter their own faces as they walk through the sculpture's opening. And through this face-to-face encounter, Arch has a potential to place its visitors under a scrutiny that bears resemblance to the requisite process at the cities of refuge. The sculpture doesn't conduct a trial necessarily to determine whether visitors are innocent of murder, but it does provoke a reflective examination that might awaken those passing through to consider questions of belonging, questions of belonging in relation to the city, like who belongs here and to whom does this city belong? And these kinds of questions were also behind the deliberations at the cities of refuge, at the gates of the cities of refuge. In conclusion, in both the trial and the city gates and in the reflective examination at the sculpture, there's the willingness to accept the other was emphasized. Residents of the cities of refuge, most of whom were not accused killers, were charged to welcome the stranger and the sojourner into their communities. And much in the same way, Arch holds welcoming the stranger right literally in its center. The faces visitors encounter in the mirror of the sculpture's embracing figures might prompt them to see sanctuary seekers not as faceless illegals amassed at fences and gates, but as people like themselves with loved ones, fears, hopes, and dreams and aspirations, people who are entitled to all the provisions and supports that have allowed them to flourish and contribute to their own communities. And that's where I'll leave it for now. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Caleb. As people have been commenting in the chat, that's been fantastically helpful, really interesting. And you've been making some really helpful connections for us as you've described your process and the reflections that you were exploring as you found these artworks and thought about their relevance to these particular texts. So it's over to those of us that are here and have been listening to that presentation. Are there any questions or comments that anyone would like to make? Perhaps we could, come out of the screen share. And do raise a hand or use the reactions button to indicate in some way if you've got something that you would like to ask or a comment that you would like to make. So I wonder, just looking at the comments in the chat, if we could just go to Liz Bates first of all. Liz, do you want to just share your reaction and response as you've put in the chat?
Yeah, as you know, I'm not really into art. Well, having said that, I like it, I enjoy it, I don't understand it. But what I got from that was, I was there, I was among the people, I felt the hurt. I felt the hurt of the victims and the perpetrators, and an understanding of where they was coming from and what was happening. It was amazing. I felt sad. I felt happy that somebody had made something of themselves. It was just a journey throughout. Wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments that people would like to share? I think one of the fascinating things about your reflections was the comment about the focus on people's faces. And you know, the importance of seeing those who are in these very difficult situations as fully human, and people like us, you know, there but for the grace of God. It reminded me of an exhibition that we hosted here at St Martin in the Fields, where the artist, with the permission of people who were asylum seekers in this country, had erased by scraping over the faces of actual asylum seekers as a way of graphically depicting the way in which the asylum system in this country essentially dehumanizes people. And you know, again, that was about the focus on the face, which was one of the key things that you were identifying too, Caleb, I think.
Yeah, that I really like those. I really like art that is very interactive like that. Scratching over people's faces. I think that's a very powerful way of showing that kind of dehumanization process that happens so often. And yeah, I think that's what really attracted me to Ai Weiwei's works, because they're these immersive works, and they encourage interaction, which can be very powerful.
Absolutely, thank you. Ben, I think you were going to come in.
Yeah, it was more of a comment, really. I know a few people who are involved in a foundation called the Oasis Foundation and Trust, and they've recently acquired some secure schools. So it's the idea of, instead of sort of young offenders institutes, treating them more like schools. And I was thinking just that, and I really want to share this video with my friend Steve, because that idea of sanctuary city just seems to fit that so well. This place of security and this place of opportunity, you know, as opposed to condemnation and disregard, I guess. But yeah, really nice to hear your journey as well. So such a good process. Thanks, Caleb.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Tamara, do come in.
Yeah, Caleb, thank you. That was incredible. It was really, really amazing. I was really, it's so interesting the way you started talking about faces and how important those are in all of these pieces of art. And then it was amazing when you turned to looking at the archway piece of art. I'm afraid I'll pronounce the name wrong, but and then the mirror that's built into it, and the turning it all the way around of looking at our own faces and considering maybe our own part in either being alienated or the one alienating. And I just wondered whether the artist themselves, whether that was an intentional step or whether that was something that if you know that, whether that was something they did intentionally or whether that just happened to be a side effect.
I mean, it was intentional that he put the reflective material in the entranceway. And if you look at the painting, or not the painting, the I don't know if I can share that photo of it again. I find it interesting that let me see here. So if you look at this, it's not a straight mirror. There's still some distortion in there. So I don't know if Ai Weiwei doesn't, at least in my research, doesn't talk very much about what his intentions were with this work, and I suspect that because of the warping with the mirror, that this may not have been his intention, or at least not consciously. And but I still think it has that effect. In fact, the warping might even lead people to look into the reflection, just because it's different than what they're used to looking at in a mirror.
That helpfully, I think, opens up sort of an aspect of interpretation more generally in terms of artwork. That you know, what would originally have been in the artist's mind when they created the work doesn't have to then encompass the sole range of reference that the work can generate as people come and view it and respond to it. So, you know, what you've just been talking about in terms of elements of interpretation for that work that may go beyond what the artist originally intended is, you know, a part of what we bring to viewing the art and to the way in which we bring it into conversation with all sorts of other aspects of our lives and our references. And in this particular instance, you know, passages from the Bible. Okay, Liz, do you want to add to your comment that you've just posted?
But it's just that the distortion on the inside of the arch is like, it's not seeing you as perfect. There are facets to you that are not perfect. And we shouldn't judge the people coming through the gates because we don't know the whole story.
Thanks, Liz. Sorry, were you going to respond to that, Caleb? Sorry.
I think that's a really great interpretation. Adds an additional layer to the symbolism of arch. I think it's really rich as well. Thank you.
That's great. So we've got Casey and then Savoy.
Thanks, Jonathan. Caleb, appreciate you taking us through this. The thing that I kept coming back to while I was listening to you, both because of my experience, as you'll probably make out from my accent, I'm not originally from the UK, and I worked out that neither are you, both from your accent and from your bio. And so the question I want to ask you, as someone who comes from sort of biblical studies as a background, is how did the experience of exploring these texts in this way and with these images teach you something about your own positionality with your sort of respect to the text, and how it changed the way that you understood the way you were reading the text and what the text was saying to you sort of from beginning to end, and your own experience as a migrant as relates to those things?
Well, when I started off researching for this exhibition, I in addition to the text, I was consulting biblical commentaries, and most of the biblical, I think all of the biblical commentaries I looked at, they really focus on kind of the legal aspects of the cities of refuge, and really, it was, in some ways, it's, I mean, I find that interesting as well, but the artworks, I mean, it was that article I read would really change my perspective, to look at something that these commentaries were not looking at, which was the position of the person actually going through this legal process, and that in turn provided a lens, or colored the way it gave me an interpretive frame for the artworks, and then there's this reciprocal process where the artworks are then informing my interpretation is forming the artworks in that sense. So in that sense, it's interesting. I'm currently residing in the UK, and in fact, in my growing up, I grew up overseas in South America, and so I've felt kind of displacement, maybe not to the same, or probably not to the same extent of many of these refugees. I wasn't under threat or anything like that. My life wasn't endangered. And it's interesting you brought up my own experience, because that's something I didn't actually consider when I was working on this. I'd have to think about that a lot more. Thank you for bringing that up.
And Savoy. Thank you.
Hey, Caleb. I really loved how you're hearing how your process unfolded and sort of how your mind was working around this. And I see so many applications. It's powerful to connect scripture and the visual. And I think art is very much the language of the people. As a minister of religion, I just found this very inspiring, and my mind is spinning. I would love to hear from you how you would imagine sort of taking this concept the next step further into, praxis in an ecclesial context, sort of in a church.
That's a good question. I've been actually mulling over that quite a lot, and of course I can think of, if someone was like doing a sermon on cities of refuge, they might be able to draw from this. I don't know if anyone, if I have never heard of a sermon on the cities of refuge. I've never heard. I know I was talking earlier with Jonathan about St. Martin's in the Fields, ministries to asylum seekers and refugees, and I wonder, I might ask Jonathan, like, I wonder if an exhibition like this might be used in those contexts, maybe in training or in workshops or something like that. I don't know. What do you think, Jonathan?
Yeah, I would think that would be absolutely viable. So, I think sort of reflecting on an exhibition like this is something that could potentially inspire people to involvement and to action, so could be used to catalyze that in various ways, either to begin conversations about some kind of new initiative, or to encourage people into an existing initiative. The visual commentary on scripture more generally is developing a number of applications for specific use within churches. So during Advent and Lent, they've put together particular combinations of exhibitions that provide resources for either for sort of resourcing those who are then sharing at those particular times, or for groups within a parish or a church to look at. They've begun trialing with a certain number of churches, sort of developing Lent courses that are based on the exhibitions. So I think we'll see more of that kind of material coming from them in future. You know, I know that Ben Quash, who was with us earlier, who directs the project, and his team more generally, you know, would be very keen to hear any thoughts or ideas for anyone on these calls. If you've got thoughts and ideas about ways of making this material more readily accessible within an ecclesiastical context. So thank you very much for that, and much thanks to Caleb for all that he shared. It's been a tremendous presentation, as many people have said and commented on in the chat, and both so helpful in terms of your interpretive process and the way in which you've been engaging with the text. But also that dialogue and conversation between text and image, and the way in which you've used that to open up the issues which are, you know, as we all know, very live and significant issues within our world and within our churches and immediate context. So huge thanks to you for all of that. Ben has been posting information about other Heart Edge events in the chat, so do click on those links or save the chat using the icon with the 3 buttons, so that you've got that information going forward. There is one more in this series, this short series that we've been doing together with curators from the visual commentary on scripture. So Ben has put the information about that in the chat as well. And we, in a week or two's time, we're going to hear from Susanna Snyder, who will be talking about the exhibition that she curated that looks at chapters 3 and 4 from the book of Ruth, and which also bring us back to this vital issue for our time of how we respond to those who are refugees. If you want to think through that issue some more, then do return for Susanna's session, which is on Tuesday the 25th of May, again at 2 o'clock, and the link is in the chat. So having said all of that, it simply remains for me to thank all of you for coming, for all that you've shared, both in the chat and with your comments and questions, and most of all to thank Caleb so much for all he shared. Our thanks to you, and we look forward to seeing you all again at another Heart Edge event before too long. All the best, and see you soon.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.